نعترف لحزب الله بأي حقوق تتقدم على حق الدولة في قرارات السلم والحرب.
Good afternoon. You're watching Future Television on this March 2nd. I'm Yumna Naufal. These are today's headlines. Health Minister Wael Abu Fahoud orders an immediate investigation into the death of a 4-month-old baby after 2 hospitals refused to admit him in Akkad. Syrian regime forces and Kurdish militia fight separate battles with ISIS in a strategic area near the Iraqi and Turkish borders. And tensions rise as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lands in Washington ahead of his speech to Congress against a possible nuclear deal with Iran. Health Minister Wael Abu Fahoud is ordering an immediate investigation into the death of a 4-month-old baby after 2 hospitals refused to admit him in the North Lebanon district of Akkad. Security sources told the Daily Star that both Rahal Hospital and Al Yusuf Hospital in Akkad would not admit the baby boy, Abdul Raouf Munir al-Houli, citing lack of empty beds. A health ministry statement said Abu Fahoud asked the father to brief ministry officials about the circumstances of his son's death while summoning the directors of the 2 hospitals for interrogation. While stressing that nothing can compensate the loss of a child, Abu Fahoud vowed to prevent patients and their families from facing humiliation at hospital doors and to secure the right of all citizens for proper medical care. A Hezbollah delegation visited the Tashnag party headquarters in Burj Hamoud and met with its newly elected Secretary General MP Hagab Pakradunian. The delegation, which was headed by Hezbollah Politburo Chief Ibrahim Amin al-Sayed, included the head of loyalty to the resistance bloc MP Muhammad Raad, MP Ali al-Muqdad, Minister Mohammed Fnesh, former lawmaker Amin Shari, and Politburo member Mahmoud Kamati. The Hezbollah officials met with Pakradunian, his deputy Avedis Kidanian, and Tashnag officials Hagab Havasjan and Rafi Ashkarian. The delegation's visit was aimed at congratulating him on his election as Tashnag Secretary General last month. He took the party's 2-year leadership from his predecessor Hagab Khatcharian. Another story that is making headlines, well, Interior Minister Nuhad Mashnu is adamant that he will not sign contracts from civil marriages performed in Lebanon. Civil marriage is not an administrative decision-making, he said. The solution lies only with a civil law regarding personal status issues. Let the activist go to Parliament and demand a civil law on personal status. Then I will be the first one to sign the contracts, Mashnu said. This comes after hundreds of students and activists, many from the American University of Beirut, marched on Sunday from the AUB campus to the Interior Ministry to demand that Lebanon support civil marriages. Standing in front of the Interior Ministry near the Sanaya Public Park, protesters shouted slogans calling for secularism and civil rights. A group of Syrian opposition forces have rejected UN envoy Staffan de Mistura's proposal for a temporary ceasefire in the northern city of Aleppo. Syria has entered its 5th year of war. After 2 days of meetings in Turkey, Aleppo's newly formed Revolutionary Council said that they refuse to meet the envoy unless he proposes a comprehensive solution to the Syrian crisis that excluded President Bashar al-Assad and his government. Referring to Assad, a delegate of the council said that the opposition will not accept a deal that involves a person who destroyed their country, killed the displaced people. The Revolutionary Council released a separate statement saying that they refuse to meet with Staffan de Mistura if it is not on the basis of a comprehensive solution to Syria's drama through the exit of Bashar al-Assad and his chief of staff and the prosecution of war criminals. A Saudi diplomat kidnapped in Yemen almost 3 years ago and handed over to Al-Qaeda has been freed and returned to the kingdom, according to the Interior Ministry. Abdullah al-Khalidi, the deputy counsel in the southern port city of Aden, who was kidnapped on March 28, 2012, was freed following intense efforts by the Saudi intelligence services. This was according to a ministry statement carried by the official SPA news agency. Less than 1 month after his abduction, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula demanded the freeing of all of its members detained in Saudi Arabia, as well as a ransom in exchange for the diplomat's release. His captors initially asked for $10 million, but later doubled the ransom to demand $20 million. It was unclear if Saudi authorities did pay money in exchange for his eventual release. Coming up next, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry meets with Iranian Foreign Minister in Switzerland. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the English news here on Future Television. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has landed in Washington ahead of his controversial speech to Congress, where he is expected to warn against a possible nuclear deal with Iran. The United States and Israel showed signs of seeking to diffuse tensions, but policy differences between the two allies over the negotiations with Iran remain firm as Netanyahu arrived in the United States for a speech which had imperiled ties between the two allies. Israel fears that U.S. President Barack Obama's Iran diplomacy, with an end-of-March deadline for a framework accord, will allow its arch-foe to develop atomic weapons, something Tehran has continued to deny. By accepting an invitation from the Republican Party to address Congress, the Israeli leader infuriated the Obama administration, which said it was not told of the speech before plans were made public in an apparent breach of protocol, saying it was Israel's impression that members of Congress do not necessarily know the details of the deal coming together, which they do not see as a good deal. The official said Netanyahu in his speech would give a detailed explanation of his objections to an Iranian deal. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is in Switzerland along with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif as part of the ongoing EU-coordinated talks between Iran and the 5+1 group permanent members of the UN Security Council. A deal on Iran's nuclear program could be concluded this week if the U.S. and other Western countries have sufficient political will and agree to remove sanctions on Tehran.
And the most obvious roadblock, I have to say to you, is self-inflicted. I'm talking, of course, about HRC's deeply concerning record on Israel. No one in this room can deny that there is an unbalanced focus on one democratic country. It must be said that the HRC's obsession with Israel actually risks undermining the credibility of the entire organization. It has the potential to limit the good that we have to do. No one should doubt for a second that the United States will measure these things, I hope, fairly and dispassionately, but we will oppose any effort by any group or participant in the UN system to arbitrarily and regularly delegitimize or isolate Israel, not just in the HRC, but wherever it occurs.
It depends on whether the political will in order to reach an agreement does exist. We have exhibited that political will by actually participating in these discussions, by showing that Iran wants to find a deal, and we have gone the extra mile. We have brought our highest authorities, including the head of our Atomic Energy Organization, in order to make sure that we leave no stone unturned in order to find a mutually acceptable solution. Of course, our negotiating partners, particularly the Western countries and particularly the United States, must once and for all come to the political understanding that sanctions and agreement don't go together. If they want an agreement, sanctions must go. Sanctions, they have to realize, are not an asset, have never been an asset, they're a liability, and this liability, the sooner they remove this liability from the table, the sooner we get to an agreement.
Former chess champion and rights activist Garry Kasparov says the United States should stop negotiating with Russian President Vladimir Putin and instead provide weapons to Ukraine. Speaking to NBC's Meet the Press about the murder of Kremlin critic Boris Nemtsov, he blasted what he called the 24/7 propaganda of hatred in Russia under Putin's regime.
Whether he gave a direct order, I don't know, probably we'll never know, but definitely the atmosphere in the country with 24/7 propaganda of hatred, where people who disagreed with Putin have been portrayed as national traitors, the fifth columnist, enemies of the state, and Boris was one of the most formidable critics of Putin's regime. Yeah, but stop pretending that you're dealing with another democratic elected leader. Stop making deals and stop trying to bring Putin to the negotiating table, because his agenda is totally opposite to the agenda of the United States or Europe. Putin wants to destroy Ukrainian statehood. Putin wants crisis, because crisis, wars, the lack of international security, those are elements that are absolutely vital for his survival in Russia. And one of the first things to be done is just to make sure that Ukraine can resist Putin's aggression. So Ukraine needs weapons, and that will be the best thing to be done to remember Boris Nemtsov.
Lady Gaga plunged into the icy waters of Chicago's Lake Michigan at a fundraiser for the Special Olympics. The singer's fiancé, actor Taylor Kinney, carried her into the water on his back. Lady Gaga recently announced her engagement to the Chicago fire actor. And also, actor Vince Vaughn also took the icy plunge. He went in up with his knees, then fell backwards into the water as bagpipes played on. The air temperature was a frigid -7 degrees Celsius, -20 degrees Celsius, sorry, at the time of the plunge, according to the U.S. National Weather Service. Thousands of others also made the plunge, with many dressed in costumes. Last year, comedian Jimmy Fallon jumped in wearing a suit and tie and helped raise more than $1 million. That's Elmo. That looks very cold. Come rain or shine, the Cinderella cast continue to premiere their new Disney movie all around the world. The live-action feature, inspired by the classic fairy tale from Disney's 1950 animated movie, is more than your typical Cinderella story. This time it's guided by two words: courage and kindness.
My mother's all dressed.
It would be an insult to take you to the palace dressed in these old rags. You shall not go to the ball.
Excuse me. Why are you crying?
Who are you?
That's better. My fairy godmother.
I must admit that Cinderella was never a fairy story that I gravitated towards, because I found the character quite passive. And this is a really active retelling of it. It's not some sort of kick-ass, gun-wielding, gun-toting kind of so-called contemporary version. It's a quietly powerful rendition of the character, and you really understand why she endures what she does, because the more tragedy that gets heaped upon her, the more open and generous and compassionate she becomes as a human being. And for any child to take that away, any child who's experienced bullying, to say, deal with your opponents with pity and grace and dignity. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. It's a very quiet but powerful message.
Her stepmother-to-be was a woman of keen feeling and refined taste, and she too had known grief, but she wore it wonderfully well.
They were incredibly evil shoes. I mean, when you're wearing green a lot of the time, the colour of envy, then you can often play against it. So, having such a deep collaboration with Sandy early on was a really big influence for me in the movie.
Fairy Tale opens in theaters across Lebanon on March 12th. And on that note, let me remind you of our headlines. Health Minister Wael Abu Faoud orders an immediate investigation into the death of a 4-month-old baby after 2 hospitals refused to admit him in Akkad. Syrian regime forces and Kurdish militia fighters separate battles with ISIS in a strategic area near the Iraq and Turkish borders. Tensions rise as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lands in Washington ahead of his speech to Congress against a possible nuclear deal with Iran. Your Monday headlines live on Future Television. Catch us again tomorrow at 4:20 for the latest. Have a good one.
لن نعترف لحزب الله بأي حقوق تتقدم على حق الدولة في قرارات